So our next speaker is no stranger to all of us here at ADIA Lab in Abu Dhabi. He's the co-founder and CTO of Intellectual Ventures. He's a pioneer in innovation-driven healthcare technologies, but he's also a valued member of ADIA Lab's advisory board. Today he's going to share with us his thinking on the manifold impacts of new technology in healthcare. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edward Jung.
I always think it's a challenge to come here because I'm part of this amazing advisory board for ADIA Lab, but I'm the only person who doesn't publish papers. So when I'm asked to come and talk, I'm always wondering what I should talk about. I only publish in the patent office. I'm an inventor. And if you think that peer review is complicated and uncertain, well, you should publish at the patent office. They can basically retract your paper 20 years later, so it's kind of a different environment. I'm a very fortunate person not only to be here among some amazing people drawn upon all over in the world, but I kind of lived through a phase, and many of us here did, which is unique in history. We're really seeing the digitalization of everything. And I was very lucky, it had nothing to do with design or plan, to be in places where a lot of that digitalization happened. Whether it was in biology, I happened to go to San Diego to use the Cray supercomputer there, a national resource, which was a very new idea back then. And that computer is, I think, 1/10,000th as powerful as my phone. So that's how progress has moved. But I was there during the time where the PDP group formed and backpropagation and neural networks sort of took off. I was obviously there for the PC revolution, for the rise of computer graphics and gaming, and then watched how this digitalization unlocked incredible amounts of innovation globally in deep tech. But I'm going to talk today a bit about healthcare, and we're going to first start by talking about why is healthcare interesting. Besides the obvious reason that we all are interested in our health and we're interested in other people's health, the people we care about, there's also this connection that I think is very economic. These are some slides I gave last year when I was proposing that we look at healthcare more like we look at climate as a very, very big data problem. But the key takeaways here is that we went through a phase of about majority of 100 years where we massively increased the lifespan of humans all over the world. And that created a massive GDP expansion. By some estimates, it's over half of the GDP expansion of the Western world came from this. Huge value from just increasing productive lifespan. Now, of course, early on, it was low-hanging fruit. Just basic healthcare, infectious disease, antibiotics gave us great gains. But then it started to become more complicated because we had to use very, very deep science and very long-dated research to try to find therapeutics that would get us more and more lifespan. From an ROI perspective, those early low-hanging fruit were very profitable. And today, unfortunately, we're running into a system where the standard way of doing small molecule drugs has a relatively low ROI, which is causing some consternation in that community. But we are all motivated by the fact in this last 100 years, we added, by WTO estimates, over $500 trillion of economic value by increasing the productive lifespan, the lifespan while people can work and actually produce economics back into society. And then we can basically tax them and use it for research and kind of cycle through this R&D to improve lifespan some more. But as those numbers get lower, we run into some interesting issues. So in the first half of this 100 years I'm talking about, we mostly gain lifespan from early years, birth and childhood. And it's pretty obvious to think about if you make someone productive from birth or childhood, you get their whole life for them to actually be productive in society. Nowadays, we're getting most of the gains toward the end of life. And of course, if you extend the end of life, you're not getting as much productivity out of the person whose life you extended. So the hard economics of this is basically you're getting a lower return off of these therapeutics that we're doing. This is just a chart of net economic value. The slopes may look the same, but the y-axis on these two are very, very different. So basically, you're just not getting the return from what we're doing today. And this leads to this paradox that we have a lot of R&D money going in, and results aren't coming out quite as well as we would like. And this also leads to an interesting point about the bottleneck of science itself. You know, that's the notion. We have over 1,000 AI devices that are FDA cleared, but almost half of them don't have clear validation. And yet we're sitting on top of this amazing tech stack, which continues to grow. We've had over a decade, almost 2 decades, of $1 trillion a year R&D spending in the world. And that's a lot of spend. Now, the media may not be able to cover all of it, but there's tremendous amounts of new technology coming out of the ground, essentially. And it's an unprecedented amount. And LLMs and AIs are going to make that stuff happen faster, not only because they're more explainable, the technology is more explainable to people, but also the AIs and LLMs are themselves being used to advance the technology, for example, in material science or protein engineering and so on. So I'm not going to go through them all, but we are really, you know, it's almost like having a color palette going from black and white to 16 million colors. There's just many things that you can paint with now that can create new innovations on top of deep technology. I talked to a number of students regularly, and it's really amazing if you think about what it's like to be an undergraduate student today, powered by an LLM that you can ask almost any question to, and it's mostly right. But you can ask a question about any of these topics that you may start off by almost knowing nothing about, and then get educated very rapidly about. This would be like my dream when I was young. Now, the thing that's amazing about what has been done here, I mean, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, is that we've taken a sampling of many of these technologies and brought them together into one place. And that's relatively unique. One might think that digitalization and AI unifies them, but they're also very interesting from the standpoint that ADIA Lab and UAE is a place where these things are coming together. So I originally had thought I'd be talking about my talk at day 3, and you would have actually seen all of these presentations, but unfortunately you've not seen them all. So I'm going to try not to butcher explaining them before some of the people in the room here are going to go up there and explain them today and tomorrow, and also at the panels. But what you will see is that these are all pieces of a puzzle that can be assembled together to create tremendous value in different things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Obviously, high-performance computing and AI and machine learning, these are things that almost everyone in the room have heard about. But I'm going to drill down on a couple that might be less obvious to you. So one is privacy-enhancing technology. We have incredible representation about this technology. But I was at Davos earlier this year explaining to governments who largely were not aware of this technology, that it is now possible to do computations, and even in a distributed manner, over encrypted data without ever decrypting it. What that means is that many of the things that we classically thought were privacy problems are no longer theoretically privacy problems. And this unlocks a lot of value in data that before we thought we could not unlock. This is actually quite fundamental. It's it's a tremendous breakthrough that we can now compute over encrypted data. This actually changes a lot of the ways we would look at policy and liberate the value of data, as well as using other technologies like tokenization and blockchain to fairly distribute, equitably distribute, the value of that data back to the people who are generating it. There's a big area of trustworthy AI, And we've touched on this in many different ways, that when you can't explain how AI is coming up with its solutions, and you don't understand its motivations or trust, this creates a problem when more and more of us start relying on it. There's, again, a big theoretical underpinning of how this actually can be done. It's a very promising area, which, again, I think many people are not very aware of. We are seeing everything is getting tokenized and digitized, and economic modeling and things like digital assets are a big part of this. Now, one of the reasons I'm very excited that the three big topics in ADIA Lab are climate, healthcare, and essentially finance or economics is because they actually represent a really interesting tripod of how we can actually look at managing AI. AI as just a consumer product is going to go out of control. Much like we saw social media, the incentives that exist for AI to succeed in consumers are just to make consumers happy. So when I was at Davos, I talked to regulators about how allowing AIs and personal AIs to be generated and then selected on an app store by humans is a lot like legalizing heroin. So if you think about, let's say, a dozen friend AIs or therapy AIs listed on an app store, which one do you think people are going to pick the most and buy the most? Is it the one that makes you healthier or the one that makes you feel better? It's like voting for your parents, okay? It's not a good system to actually create intrinsic value. But on the other hand, when we look at healthcare, it is coming from an environment that is extremely regulated and has a set of metrics that are usually quite clear. And so it's a very interesting place to go put AI technology because we cannot help but regulate that one, as opposed to, let's say, the AI companion or friend. Likewise, we are looking at an environment in digitalization where we have to incentivize people to do the right thing. And incentivization is about creating some kind of metric that people are aligned around. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. And that is something that finance is good at. Okay? Finance and economics is all about trying to create those kind of incentives and those kind of mechanisms and measurements that drive that kind of economy. And then finally, when we look at climate, climate went through a fundamental transformation in the last 20 years from what I would call a classic science, where you thought about, well, maybe this causes this, and you tested it in some small environment, to the largest data science we have, where we collect data from all over the world that it looks largely uncorrelated and use amazing amounts of supercomputing power and brain power to figure out how to actually make some kind of reasoned assumptions and reasoned conclusions about what's happening in an incredibly complex system. Now, last year I talked about how it'd be great to take those kind of capabilities and then apply them to healthcare. But likewise, I'd love to take the kind of thought that we're putting into incentivizing people and their behaviors and put that into healthcare too. Okay? So these three components of the stool, I think, are very important kind of sandboxes for us to learn how we're actually going to control the technologies that we're driving forward. Now, I'm not going to go through, obviously, everyone's presentation here, but you will see that in the agenda, we have a number of people talking about all these different components, and I think the way that we stitch them together going forward is going to be very important. We are living in a time of massive technology readiness. So many domains are kind of maturing at the same time. These are now going to become more deployable and explainable because of AI. So we really need to question, what are we going to do with the technology? So I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do with the technology, but I'm going to talk about a couple ideas of how you can mix the technologies up in a big idea blender and then create something that might be interesting. This is food for thought, and something that I think more of us should do to try to figure out how to remix all these interesting technologies that are coming up into something that could be interesting. So these are just ideas. One, I'm calling this a universal health measurement framework. So you can take AI, ML, causal inference, trustworthy explainable AI, and high-performance computing, and you could imagine building a kind of coherent measurement set over disease, demographics, and settings. And this could be accessed by people who are looking for incentives for behavior, for regulatory frameworks, and for markets. You could create new forms of kind of KPIs or metrics that could drive economies and drive innovation. I think this would be a very interesting kind of system that will actually pull in things like the new form of clinical trials or new forms of testing that will allow us to get better and better at understanding how to apply technology to interesting, measurable outcomes. Causal computation at scale. I'm going to focus just on the counterfactual simulation part here. It's very interesting now that things are so complicated, and the tendency for us, particularly with the way media works today, is to decide to focus on one story or one narrative, and then possibly even believe it beyond where the evidence takes us. Having a trusted system that allows us to do counterfactual simulation, where you can ask questions fairly freely and understand what its impact could be on a very complex system, I think is an incredibly useful tool. There was a time back, I think it was in '98, where I was advising some medical institutions and talking about how the complexity of medical science had come to the point where it was very hard to understand how to retract a piece of evidence and then figure out what all other forms of scientific output were affected. So in other words, keeping a dependency graph of what you as a scientist were dependent upon when you actually came up with your conclusion would become more and more useful as the science became more and more complex, because when it turned out that something was incorrect or possibly only correct within certain boundaries, you would love to propagate that out to everyone who is dependent upon that knowledge. And yet, that's kind of not the way science had worked at that time. So we now have tools that can do this much, much better, and actually even posit different sort of hypotheses through the system. And I think that's going to be an incredibly important tool as we look at very complex systems and try to make decisions about that, particularly ones that are like policy that will affect many people and the way they can innovate. This is a very, I guess, positive way of looking at it. So, planetary health operating system. I'm an operating systems guy, so I had to put operating systems somewhere in here. We have a lot of interesting technology that has not been assembled like an operating system. The goal of an operating system is to manage resources. So here are the ideas that you would like to build a system that allows you to orchestrate various different public health components, but in a way that allows applications to be developed on top of them. To make everybody build the same vertical stack or get access to all of this, the rights to all of the data and so on and so forth, is too difficult. Long ago, when someone was trying to get me to explain Windows, at Microsoft, we ran into problems with the government because the government launched an antitrust investigation saying that Windows was a monopoly. And one of the reasons why is we had extended Windows into the browser. But the point of Windows as an operating system was that it was whatever technology you needed to interface the hardware with applications. And that was a new way of thinking of operating systems, because before that, operating systems were very rigidly defined as something that managed, let's say, disks and processes. The idea that as time went on, more and more innovation would occur, and so people would need things like multimedia and networking and things like that, gaming technologies and so on, meant that the operating system would change over time. And it would always be that interface between these two growing and innovating markets. Because if it wasn't there, that meant that every application had to understand how to interface with every piece of hardware, and vice versa. And that slows things down. By the time Windows 95 came out, the leading DOS applications spent 70% of their money just maintaining device drivers. In other words, trying to be compatible with all the devices that are coming out and all the new ones that are coming out. And likewise, if you came out with a new innovative piece of hardware, you had to spend most of your time trying to figure out how to write compatibility with every app that was out there, and that wasn't inefficient. So building something common in the middle was valuable. And the concept here is that when we're going to be awash with huge amounts of data, all right, and then many ways of actually coming up with reasoning over that data, and many different opinions about which reasoning is kind of sensible, not sensible, et cetera, you do need some kind of system or market to go to those things so that everyone isn't building their own data verticals. The previous presentation was talking about many aspects of this, where if you actually force everyone to build their own verticals and walled gardens, you get much less efficiency. We have the technology to do this. The thing that's interesting is that it's not being done in an open way. So I'm going to echo what the previous speaker talked about. This is a very important thing to go and push forward, whether it's in this model or a number of other ones. Now, what can you do if you build these kind of capabilities out of the technologies that we've talked about here or will be talking about here at the conference? Suddenly, you can make it much easier to write applications or use cases on top. You know, here are 3 examples that I just made up. Actually, my AI and I made it up. This is maternal and early life health. We did a number of projects in this area in China over the last 15 years. It's an easy one politically because, okay, that one, because it's hard not to think it's a good thing to take care of mothers and babies. But it is a complex problem, an evolving problem. And it's a great problem to actually build systems where you can bring those technologies I talked about together. So you can actually do experiments on hypothetication as well as track kind of the results of what's happening as you go. So people's innovation stays up to date with what's happening with, let's say, these cohorts of mothers and children. The ability to kind of explain risk factors both to innovators, scientists, as well as end users is going to be extremely important because relying on marketing groups and media to do that is not reliable. And the ability to run trials and interventions in an intelligent way so that you can run these clinical trials in a way that is looking at the global picture and not just everyone's local interest is also going to be very useful. And it's economically valuable too. I think, as I pointed out earlier, the economic value also goes for a long time, the productivity value. This one's a little near and dear to my heart. I'm one of the early co-founders of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or now the Gates Foundation Pandemic Response Group. And of course, when we made it almost 20 years ago, we envisioned that something like COVID would happen, but it hadn't happened yet. By looking at kind of what happened during COVID, we can see that although the world's response was in some ways really great in terms of scientific diffusion, and in some ways maybe not so great, there's a lot of ways we could improve this. This one's nice because there is kind of an example or a set of examples that we can look at, and you can build very good models about how much effectiveness you could theoretically get. An important component of this, though, is how you involve the public, and we really saw this in the COVID response, that getting public sentiment and understanding how to manage public sentiment through this is very important. And this is another area that I don't think we should repeat again by making the mistake of ignoring that public sentiment or assuming that it's going to go all in one direction. So building systems that allow the public to engage in asking questions and understanding how you build cohorts of people who are in support or not in support of something is going to be much more important to get on top of the problem before it starts happening and we're surprised. The value of it, of course, is very high, mostly in terms of avoided loss of GDP, but also avoided deaths. Oh, I kind of skipped over. There's also a big supply chain and manufacturing issue here too. In fact, when I was advising the US, I remember telling them when there was approximately 70-odd vaccine candidates in the pipeline that they should start building manufacturing facilities now that were agile to which ones would come out, because certainly there would be at least one that would be approved. But they needed to wait until one was approved before they started doing that, so that was kind of a real waste of time and lives. This one is near and dear to my heart. Back in '93, when before the internet was really there and people were talking about the information superhighway, I wrote a memo called Sugar, Salt, Fat. And everyone there back then, this is kind of like the last AI boom, we're talking about how great the internet would be and how it was going to uplift all of humanity and all kinds of good things would happen. The poorest child in Somalia could learn from the best instructor at Stanford, obviously one of the people here. But I said, well, I'm coming from a different background than you guys. The human mind has a dopamine reward circuit. It's been conserved for about 300 million years, so it's kind of hard to get rid of. Okay, and one of those dopamine reward circuits, which we evolved through 99.9% of human history, when we couldn't get sugar, salt, and fat easily, makes us really crave sugar, salt, and fat. And I said, so after World War I and II, when we got really good at manufacturing, logistics, finance, et cetera, we applied it to private enterprise, and one of the best enterprises to apply it to were sugar, salt, and fat. And so if you add just tobacco and alcohol to this, these kind of sin businesses were the largest cash flows other than natural resources. It took us another 20 or 30 years for the science to realize that when you give 1 billion people a lot of sugar, salt, and fat, it's not healthy for you. And then we spent another 20 or 30 years trying to figure out how to mitigate that. And it was not until well after I wrote that memo, the first time happened when more investment money went into healthy living than unhealthy living. And smart kids who graduated colleges would no longer go to those unhealthy living companies. So that's kind of the beginning of a shift. But in '93, that memo wasn't really about sugar, salt, fat. It was about the information superhighway. Back then, we didn't see the browser yet, so we thought it was millions of channels. And I said, in a world of millions of channels, we're going to run into another problem, which is that we have a dopamine response for actually being popular, being around like-minded people, and having agency. But again, through most of human history, we're geographically locked, and so we had to be pro-social in order to survive. We had to barter our value to society in order to receive from society things we needed to live. So whatever our weird individual tendencies might have been, we would moderate them in order to be pro-social. And that would mean that we would put them in a bit of control. But when there's 1 million channels around, no matter how weird your interests were for agency, popularity, and like-minded people, you would find a community across the entire world and surround yourself with that community, and before you know it, it would balkanize the world. Now, Bill didn't like that memo, so he did not put it in his book, but he did remember it for the next 20 years and would always bring it up at dinner time. So this is where we are now. It is a very natural thing, as I mentioned about consumer product companies, to have this cycle where you want to feed the dopamine addiction, because that's a good business. What better business is there than one that's built into our genetics? So we know that it does all kinds of things, like in too much excess, it degrades sleep, mood, it creates anxiety, et cetera, and we are certainly seeing this today. How do you combat that? My view is the only way to combat that is to use these technologies we're talking about to build personalized counter-incentives and also social counter-incentives to allow friends, family, other interested people to promote more healthy habits. And I think this is kind of in some ways, to me, one of the most interesting ways that we can apply this technology to healthcare. We know that now mental health is going to be the largest impairment of work productivity going forward. If you expand mental health now to consider the balkanization due to social media, then I think that's already happened. So, to conclude, why are we here? I think the great vision of what happened here in the UAE and what's happening with ADIA Lab is to kind of be a connector and a sandbox to allow all these different technologies and people who promote them to come together, to have conversations like this. I think that's going to create a lot of value for the world because the rest of the world's having difficulty with this. I gave a presentation about 3 years ago to leadership here where I mentioned that unlike 30 or 40 years ago, today the technologies that are driving the world forward require policy. In my day, they didn't. We could do another semiconductor or another piece of software without regulation. But today, whether you're looking at digital finance, or you're using something in climate, or you're looking at something with healthcare, this requires policy and policy leadership. And large countries which have an advantage in producing the technologies have a disadvantage in actually producing agile policy. Same thing, the global geopolitics is very different. China and the US has lost a lot of trust in the world as being leaders for everyone to follow. This creates an opportunity. I call this the power of the small, that small countries like the UAE have superpowers. If they have a high per capita GDP and they're policy agile, then all these sort of things accrue huge advantages to them to lead the rest of the world by integrating the technologies from everywhere, putting them together into solutions that work, testing those solutions, and showing the world how they can be de-risked. This is very, very important today because it is a thing that is most difficult in the large countries to do. Here, collaboration is essential, not optional, and it's a place where the country and I think organizations like ADIA Lab can succeed. So, 3 thoughts to take away. We are not in a technology problem. We have more than enough technology to solve all these problems. In fact, we produce, if anything, too much technology. Almost any idea that can be done by a company is going to be done 100 times. This is not true 40 years ago. It is absolutely true today. So what we now need is new narratives, new incentives, and policy. Okay, this is really the problem of innovation now. It's no longer a technological problem. And then if we have that, we can apply it to areas like healthcare, climate, finance, and everything else. Thank you.
So we'll open up again for 2 questions, please.
Good morning. I really enjoyed your last 2 slides in specific. I have 2 policy questions for you coming from the United States. There was a memo that was leaked 2 weeks ago. Someone at Amazon said 300,000 jobs will be let go or will be lost because of AI and machinization of tasks. How would AI, that we all talk about and rave about, not lead to job losses at massive levels? Living in California a year and a half ago, there were demonstrations by writers on Hollywood saying that we're going to be losing our jobs because AI is going to write scenarios and films for us. That's number 1, which means a problem that it will be coming. In fact, if you can foresee that, you can see, for example, armed forces of the United States will probably have autonomous fighting units that will replace infantry units, looking at the war in Ukraine. Number 2 is this. In the United States, Canada, and the UK, we have 3 major healthcare issues. In the US is the price, affordability. In the UK is quality, and in Canada is not having on-time care. How would AI be able to solve policy problems of these 2 sorts that I mentioned to you? Thank you.
Okay, those are 2 really hard questions to answer in a couple of minutes. In terms of the loss of jobs, yes, that happens with technology. It's easy to brush it off by looking at previous waves where that loss of jobs ushered in prosperity that kind of within a generation, improved things. Unfortunately, that within a generation is very operational important term because there's a lost generation in there. And today, that lost generation can cause probably more political trouble than they could before. So that is a very interesting problem that I think people haven't looked at it, call it sociology or call it political economics. But I think we do have tools to look at that better. I don't have an answer to that. I do think it's something that people should be thinking more about, but unfortunately in the US, it's very hard to get people to think about that because they're thinking about other things. To your second question, again, this is going back to my slide earlier. The technology is there to have AI help with problems like you're talking about. I think the real problem is the regulatory will to change things or not. Now, like I said, the good news about healthcare is it's very conservative and protected. The bad news about it is it's very conservative and protected. So there's good reasons that countries like the UK and US don't really want to innovate too much in that area. It's risky. But I think, again, smaller countries and other pilots, especially with the developing world, like we're now seeing much of the technologies we're doing with the Gates Foundation and developing world is actually now coming back to the developed world. So kind of in the opposite direction because they're more, it sounds bad, but they're more desperate and willing to take more risk in some of those areas. And so I think taking advantage of that will be interesting. One of the most key, I talked to more than 80 governments during COVID. And the one thing I found is there was never a case I was talking to someone in government who wanted people to die. They all had good intentions. But one of the things that was very hard for them is I said, once the WHO policy sort of broke down and governments were doing all sorts of different things, the one good thing that comes out of that is you can learn from other people's experiments, successes and mistakes. And yet very few countries had even the infrastructure to do that learning, right? So AIs could really help with that, but I don't know if there's a will to adopt it and listen to what they say. That's, again, I think a power of the small thing. Small countries will be advantaged in that. In fact, small countries were among the best performers during COVID.
Right there.
Good morning, everyone. This is Sultan from Mubadala. Thank you very much today for your speech. I think that was extremely insightful, and the way that you ended it with the 3 points made me think of something, to be honest. Your second point really mentioned that, yes, we have the tech stack, we have enough technology, but what we need to have is basically the narrative and incentives. This is right, but what do you think about the applied AI expertise? Do we have enough applied AI scientists that can bridge between AI and the industry? Yes, we have industry experts. Yes, we have AI experts. But do you think we have enough applied AI experts? Thank you.
We never have enough to fulfill optimistic potential, but we always have enough to actually make progress. Okay, so I think if we discount some of the hype that's in AI right now, that again exists for good market reasons, I guess, but there's more than enough skill, capability, and even compute power to start doing very interesting things. It's just not necessarily getting allocated that way, right? There's a lot of moonshots happening, and there's a lot of very, very conservative uses of AI. So you have an interesting case where if you look at corporate adoption of AI, it's relatively unsuccessful because they're not really leaning into it hard. And yet at the same time, you see immense amounts of spending on something that is certainly going to have at least 3 or 4 new generations of change. So at both ends, it's kind of not wise, but this is the way the market works, and there's a lot of waste, but it still works, right? I mean, the internet bubble blew up a tremendous amount of value, but we still got a lot of value out of the internet, so it happens. We actually have a whole set of displays at my company about all these things that kind of blow up, and then you never heard of it. So we have an example of like 300-something different types of typewriters. There's ones where you used to have to turn a dial and push a button and all that, before we came up with the typewriter that we know and love today. Same thing with slide rules and fire hoses, and almost anything goes through this, Cambrian explosion of diversity before it kind of settles down into the ones that work. And I think that's just kind of we should expect that. Yeah. I think systems like being done here again are very interesting because they don't have the liberty maybe to quite overspend, but also have no plan whatsoever. So somewhere in between is an interesting place to be. Your organization, for example. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.